really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Well, there really was a worldwide flood.
Welcome to Creation Foundation, where we discuss the biblical worldview, its implications, and the scientific evidence relating to it. I'm Dick Temple.
And I'm Mark Finkbeiner.
And I'm Greg Morgan.
Today we're going to be discussing the geology of the southwestern United States. And you might think, what does that have to do with the biblical worldview? After all, the southwestern United States isn't even mentioned in the Bible. Or is it? 4,500 years ago, according to the Bible, there was a global flood. And that global flood included the southwestern United States. In fact, that flood was so violent that it rearranged the real estate all over the earth, so that we have what the evolutionists call a geological column, which is the layers of sedimentary rock laid down by the flood. And the geologic column is what the evolutionists base their old age of the earth on. But if that geologic column was not laid down over millions of years of time, but was actually laid down by a global flood, as all the indications are, then it very much relates to the biblical worldview. So you guys really enjoy geology. Mark, let's hear what you have to say about the Southwest geology.
Well, first of all, let's just take a look at some historical documentation. And this historical documentation is in a book. It's called the Bible. And you know, a lot of people, when you talk to people about a global flood or catastrophism, immediately they think, oh, well, that's just all religion. And I say, well, now wait a second now. If you're open-minded, let's just take a look at some historical documentation and let's just see if the scientific evidence lines up with this historical documentation. Now, in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 7, we read about a flood that was so big it covered the whole earth. Okay? And what we'll do here today is we will see if the scientific evidence lines up with this historical documentation that is mentioned in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 10 and 11, it says, "And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." So what we have here is we got two things going on. We've got a whole bunch of rain coming down for 40 days and 40 nights. But that rain is not really what flooded the earth. The Bible talks about the fountains of the great deep. And it talks about water that's shooting up all over the earth. Now, if you look at a map of the earth, now this was not discovered until about 1977, when somebody was down under the ocean and they found this mountain range that goes all the way around the earth, and it goes all the way around the earth like seams on a baseball, and it intersects itself in the Indian Ocean. And they estimate that this mountain range is about 40,000 miles, okay? And it's called the Mid-Oceanic Mountain Range and the Mid-Atlantic Mountain Range. And some of this mountain range that goes all the way around the earth is even higher than Mount Everest, which is amazing. Well, wherever you have mountains, you have earthquakes. Wherever you have earthquakes, you have volcanoes, and you have water shooting up out of the earth. And so a pretty good theory is that this is where the fountains of the great deep were erupting from. But we have many other evidences of the fountains of the great deep, where it erupted from all over around the earth. It wasn't just where the oceans are at today, which is amazing. And so if we continue on to read here in Genesis 6:17, it says, "And behold, I do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die." So everything in the earth died, that walked on the earth, except for 7 people and the animals that went into this boat that the Bible calls the ark. Okay? So we're going to take a look at this. And we're going to see what kind of scientific evidence that we have that supports this historical documentation. And of course, I just mentioned something about this mountain range that goes around the earth. There's a very good chance that there was water that jetted up out of the earth, and it reached way, way up in the air. And because of that water going way up there, it could have gone miles into the air, and it's actually what ended up bringing us the Ice Age, but we won't get into that today. That'll be another thing. Anyway, in the state of Washington, we have this mountain called Mount St. Helens. Now, we're going to look at this before we go to the southwest to make a point here. We've got this mountain called Mount St. Helens, and it erupted in 1980. And when it erupted in 1980, it ended up being a geological laboratory for a geologist to study catastrophism, and like Noah's flood. And so anyway, in May 18th, 1980, this mountain called Mount St. Helens, it erupted. And when it erupted, it created this huge landslide. So there was this landslide that came off of Mount St. Helens, and this landslide was created by two things: pressure and an earthquake. Okay, so this mountain, it was building up pressure. And the scientists, they were seeing this bulge on the side of the mountain, and it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they were telling everybody, you know, you need to leave the area because we don't know the day or the hour when this mountain is going to erupt. So anyway, finally, 8:32 a.m. in the morning, May 18th, 1980, there was this huge mudslide, and it was the biggest mudslide in recorded history, and it slid off of Mount St. Helens, and it slid off into Spirit Lake. And when it did that, it was kind of like shaking up a bottle, and the lid, the cap on the bottle, there's so much pressure, it blows the lid off, and then all the contents come out. And so you have all this steam and ash that came out of the mountain, and it's traveling at hundreds of miles an hour, extremely hot. And you have this mud flow that comes off of Mount St. Helens into Spirit Lake, and it created a tidal wave 860 feet high, and it reached the other side of this mountain range, and it uprooted all those trees, and it brought the trees back down into Spirit Lake. So it's kind of like jumping into a bathtub full of water. That water, it shoots out, and then some of it comes back in, okay? And so now you have all these trees in Spirit Lake. Now that's something I want you to remember, okay? So you got all these trees now in Spirit Lake, okay? And you've got this mountain, and it's erupting, and it's shooting out all this ash and all this steam, and it's knocking down trees, hundreds and hundreds of acres of trees. And now Spirit Lake has been displaced. It is much bigger than it once was. Okay, so anyway, now with that thought in mind, let's go to Arizona. That's the southwest. You go to Arizona, there's a petrified forest there in Arizona. It's called the Arizona Petrified Forest, except I don't think it was a petrified forest. What we're seeing here is something very similar to what happened at Mount St. Helens when this mud flow came off the face of Mount St. Helens, and it uprooted all these trees and brought it into Spirit Lake, okay? Now all those trees, now over the years, what they've been doing is they've been getting waterlogged, and guess which end goes down first? Well, the root end, that's the heavy end. So most of the trees are now going to the bottom of Spirit Lake, and they are replanting themselves. Some of the trees are laid over in Spirit Lake, okay? Well, you go to the Arizona Petrified Forest, and what do we find? But we find trees laying all over. And they're petrified. Some of them are broken up into pieces, like as if somebody took a chainsaw and sawed each one. Okay? And so anyway, all these trees are petrified. Well, here's what happened. If you look at the geology of Arizona, you can see there was a volcano. Ooh, volcano, yes, a volcano. And of course, if you find petrified trees, that obviously means you have mud, which means you had water. Okay? So Mount St. Helens, when it went off, it created a lot of flooding, lots of water, buried a lot of things, and over time, some of those trees are going to be buried. Now, I don't know if they'll ever petrify the ones at the bottom of Spirit Lake because the conditions have to be right, okay? In order to petrify a tree, you have to have hot water. Hot water absorbs a lot of minerals. The minerals then replace the tree's cells and turns the wood into stone. That's what happened in Arizona in the southwest. Okay, so you have these trees that obviously got buried by volcanic action, and then those trees, they petrified. With that thought in mind, now there's more things that's going on at Mount St. Helens, okay? So you have this eruption, you've got this mudslide, and what it's doing is it's creating layers. Layers that we're not seeing right now, all right? So Mount St. Helens erupts again in June, and I believe that was June 12th, 1980, so it erupts again in June 12th, 1980, okay? Well then, 2 years later, about 2 years later, March 19th, 1982, Mount St. Helens creates this huge mudslide, another mudslide that comes off of Mount St. Helens because of the snowpack up there. The snowpack, it begins to melt, and you have all that mud, and through this melting action, all this mud comes off of Mount St. Helens, and it comes off there fast, catastrophically. And that is when Mount St. Helens created what is called the Little Grand Canyon. Okay? So it creates this Little Grand Canyon. Now, if you look at the picture on the screen, there should be pictures coming up here. You're going to see the Little Grand Canyon. And when you look at the Little Grand Canyon, that was carved out in March 19th, 1982, you're going to see all these layers. And all these layers represent the mudslide of March 19th, the eruption of June 12th, and the eruption of May 18th, 1980. All those layers represent each one of those catastrophic actions that happen in a short period of time. Okay? And so when you look at those layers, one thing you're going to notice when you look at those layers, they're all laid down like pancakes. So in other words, if you're thinking with the geological side of your brain, in other words, you can tell that when those layers are laid down like pancakes, there was no time between each one of those layers. Very little time. So therefore, no erosion between each one of those layers. Okay? This is teaching us new evidence about geological layers, that whenever you see geological layers, they're laid down like pancakes all over the earth, which we do see. That proves right there that those layers were laid down quickly, and there was very little time between each one of those layers because there are no erosion marks. So anyway, the Little Grand Canyon was about 1,000 feet wide, 140 feet deep, and guess what? Today, you can take your students to the Little Grand Canyon, and you can show them this little river that's flowing through the Little Grand Canyon. Now, I can just see it, though, about, maybe 100, 200 years from now, some school teachers are going to take their kids to the Little Grand Canyon, and they're going to say, oh, look at that little river flowing through the Little Grand Canyon. It must have took millions of years for that little river to carve out that canyon. Nope, no way. We saw this happen. The river did not create the canyon. The canyon created a way for the river to flow through. It's just the opposite of what you might think. I just love it when I talk to an evolutionist because they always say, well, we go by what we see. Well, if you just only go by what you see, that's why you're so misled. Because sometimes you can't just go by what you see at the moment. Sometimes you've got to study all this out so that it makes sense. Okay? So anyway, now the next picture you ought to be seeing on the screen is another picture of the Little Grand Canyon. Now I want you to take a look at that real closely, because you're going to see at the top of the Little Grand Canyon, you're going to see all these layers. These layers are real thin, and they're laid down like pancakes. Okay? And then you're going to see that it's a cliff. It's a cliff, and then the canyon, it drops off, or there's an angle to the canyon. Okay? Cliff and then angle. Take a look at that picture. Now look at this next picture. Now look at what you see. The same thing. And you are looking at the Grand Canyon. At the very top, you see the cliff, and then it goes off at a very steep angle. And you see all those real small layers laid down like pancakes. And anyway, I'm going to get more into this, but Greg, I know that you have something that you want to talk about, the Grand Canyon and the Southwest geology.
One thing that I like, as Mark just said, when you look at the Grand Canyon, all these layers are laid down like pancakes. And notice that this one is laid down, and there are no riverbeds between that one and the one below it. This one's laid down, and there are no riverbeds between this one and one below it. this one's laid down, and there are no riverbeds between here. If this was really millions of years between these layers, each layer should have been eaten down, and you should have riverbeds that float across this way, and the next one up should have filled that in with the other color, so that dipping down into this, there should be some red layers. Here there should be some red dipping down into it. You don't see that. There is no evidence anywhere in the Grand Canyon of surface erosion into hills and valleys and rivers. What you do see is on top of a few of these, there's an area where you can see that there was a huge wash of water went across there. It's called sheet erosion, and this layer was once much thicker than it is now. It laid down very thickly, and then a sheet of water went across and eroded this entire area for hundreds of square miles and lowered it down to where it was again flat, because sheet erosion tends to erode things. They start out flat, they remain flat while the sheet erosion goes on. But the point is that there are no riverbeds between these layers. And that was one of the key things that converted me from believing in an ancient Earth to believing in a recent Earth. The Institute for Creation Research presented something called the Back to Genesis seminar, and I took my son to it so that he could understand that the Bible and science are reasonably consistent. I've later learned it's completely consistent. I got more out of it than my son did. I converted from believing in an ancient Earth, which I'd done since I was in 7th grade. I converted to believing in a recent creation of the Earth, and these layers are explained by the flood. And I had just gotten to the point where I was willing to say that in public, and had said it in public, and pointed that out as one of the big evidences. And then I was very shocked to see a photograph of this place, which is called the Wave at Paria. The Wave at Paria looked to me, when I first saw it, as though it were a riverbed between the layers. It's called the Wave because this portion of it looks something like a wave traveling on the ocean at Paria, because it's 6 miles south of the Paria River. But it's 70 miles north of the Grand Canyon. No, this is not evidence of a riverbed between the layers. When you look carefully, these 5 layers right here roll back on top of themselves. That's a whirlpool in sandstone. And this up here is more complex, but there are several layers that roll back on top of themselves. Another whirlpool in sandstone. Dick, I can only think of one way to create a whirlpool in sandstone. Can you think of a way to produce a whirlpool in sandstone?
The only way I can see is water moving the sand. Then you get the hardening of the water, of the sand, because of the chemical action within the sand.
That's the only way that I've seen also. This was a huge underwater landslide laying down this entire area. You can see it's rather tall, but behind this, the cliffs are 3,000 feet high, and it was a 3,000 foot high flow of mud underwater. So it was a flow that much larger even than the one at Mount St. Helens. As Mark said, Mount St. Helens is the biggest one that humans have ever observed. This one puts that to shame. But it put this whirlpool in it, it put this whirlpool in it, and it shows that this layer right here slid on top of that layer. These tilt in here, they tilt as they come out, and they're twisted as they come here. So this, the wave, is outstanding evidence for Noah's flood, and says that Noah's flood was truly catastrophic. I was fortunate enough to live in the Southwest for 5 years, a year in Flagstaff, Arizona, during which time I worked one summer at the Grand Canyon, and then I finished high school and attended the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Here is a book called In 6 Days, in which 50 people with PhDs have essays on why they believe that the Earth was created in 6 days, and several of these do discuss the flood. Some of them even discuss Southwest geology. But I had just got to the point where I was comfortable enough to talk about the flood and how I believe in a young Earth, including that there are no riverbeds between the layers. And then I was shocked when I saw a photograph of this place, which is called the Wave at Paria. At first, I thought that this was a riverbed between the layers, and my blood ran cold because I thought I had just lied, that I had just said something that wasn't true. Well, it took about a week of prayer and studying this, and I realized right here, there are 5 layers that roll back on themselves. Up here, there are several layers. It's more complicated, but they also roll back beneath themselves or on top of themselves. Don't know which way it was flowing. But this is a whirlpool in sandstone, and it's a rather large one. This is a whirlpool in sandstone. And I went there twice to make sure that this is not just an effect of the photograph or some sort of surface feature, but they really are whirlpools. And yes, they very definitely are really whirlpools. Now, Dick, I only know of one way to put a whirlpool into sandstone. Do you know how to put a whirlpool into sandstone?
Well, to make sandstone, first of all, you have to have the sand, and it has to cement together from the chemicals in there. So for it to have the chemicals there, it needs to be in water. And so we had to have a whirlpool in water moving the sand around, and the sand ended up where the water drained off.
And that's the only explanation that I can come up with as well. I believe this whole area, and you can see it's a rather tall area. In fact, the cliffs behind show some of the same features, and they're about 3,000 feet high. This whole area was a huge underwater landslide, several thousands of feet tall and hundreds of square miles in area. So the Mount St. Helens landslide was the largest that humans have ever actually observed, but this one was even larger than that, and it was flowing so fast that it formed up into layers, like what we saw at Mount St. Helens, but it flowing faster than that, and it actually had whirlpools in it, which when the flow then stopped, they were frozen in place. As the sand settled down, they went from being fairly round to being more elongated and shorter. But the wave doesn't just have features like that. The wave also has this little object. Now, I don't know how to describe that, except just to say that it looks like mud that's been shaken very violently. And I believe that's exactly what it was. Mud that was shaken very violently, probably by an earthquake. The wave also has this little feature, which took a long time to figure that one out. In fact, a child is the one who explained it to me. This area right here is where mud has slumped. This area, you can see there's parallel layers, like you find in many places in the Southwest. Here, those same layers are parallel. In between, they're all swirled together. It runs through there, and I have actually traced they are the same layers. So what happened is that all these layers were laid down in that underwater landslide. The open part here was eroded out, and then the mud here slumped down, and this began slumping also, and water was pouring out of the cliff. And what we're looking at here was once a few feet deep into this, and it came sliding out with the water, and you ended up with that, which is a de-watering feature, which means that all of it was water at the same time. All of it was water and mud at the same time. But also, where we saw that whirlpool, the top whirlpool in the earlier one, here is that same, here is that same whirlpool on the opposite cliff. The man wearing the blue shirt was standing about here, and we were looking at this cliff, but here is that same whirlpool, which means that it's not only 15 feet high and 30 feet long, which you can see in the other one, but it goes all the way across the canyon, so it's at least 50 feet in the other dimension. That's a huge whirlpool, which means it was a huge landslide. And this particular whirlpool is actually completely closed. It whirls here, around, you get the entire, both ends of the whirlpool. So the wave is a very unusual place that does show the effects of the flood in ways that are not seen elsewhere, but it fits in with the Grand Canyon. It's 70 miles north of it. And as you proceed north from there, you go up something called Kanab Canyon, and you find similar features to this all through Kanab Canyon. You find areas where it is clear that there's an underwater landslide, and this mud was laid down by that all through the Kanab Canyon. And then you go north from there, and you find also flow features in Arches National Park and just throughout the Southwest. So the Southwest is an outstanding place for finding evidence that Noah's flood really did happen and that it covered the entire southwestern United States. If it covered the entire southwestern United States and it laid down a layer that's 3,000 feet thick by 350 miles by 350 miles, well, it had to pick that up from somewhere. All that sand had to come from somewhere. And at the wave, the little tiny crystals within it have been analyzed. It came from the Appalachian Mountains, some 1,200 miles away. So to have a flood that big means that the entire continent was underwater. And I don't know how to put an entire continent underwater at once unless the entire globe is underwater. You don't just mound water up on top of the continent. The entire globe was underwater at the same time. And interestingly enough, that's what the Bible says. You can trust the Bible from the first verse to the last.
And to get that water from one side of the United States to the other, get that sand, I mean, we had to have quite a flow of water going from east to west. The moon controls the tides. The moon is going around the earth at about 1,000 miles an hour at the equator. Therefore, once you get the mountains out of the way so that the tides can keep going, you have a tide going around the earth, a swelling at 1,000 miles an hour. Now, of course, all the water's not going 1,000 miles an hour, but it picked up a lot of speed. In fact, the work that Michael Ord has done in the river rolled stones that started out in Montana and northern Idaho that went all the way to the coast indicated that this flood was moving, this water was moving at close to 100 miles an hour. It was really moving on, so it didn't have any trouble picking up that sand at the Appalachian Mountains. Another thing of interest is that when I went to school, they taught me that the Appalachian Mountains were older than the Rocky Mountains because there was more erosion on the Appalachian Mountains. Well, that makes perfect sense if during the end of the global flood, the Appalachian Mountains came up first. Then the water picked up the erosion, picked up the sand from the Appalachian Mountains as it eroded it, carried it across, clear across the United States, and then the Rocky Mountains came up and slowed it down again, and then we had the sand deposits. You know, Noah and his family probably had quite a time in that ark, you know, because you got the fountains of the great deep coming up, you know, there's volcanoes going on, and that boat is going to be a-rocking, you know, I imagine that there was some seasick animals. It was an exciting time. And you know, as we look at our ancient history concerning the peoples that inhabit the earth today, we find out how they spread out from the Tower of Babel following the time Noah got off the ark. And as we look at the geology, it doesn't really matter where you look at the geology in the earth, it speaks of a global flood. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth forth knowledge. There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard.
The Bible talks about a worldwide flood, of a worldwide flood, of a worldwide flood. If there really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down with water all over the earth. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down with water all over the earth. Well, there really was a worldwide flood. Just look at the stony